Well, there's a strange kind of grace that sometimes comes, not when we see clearly, but when we lose our sight, when everything we thought we knew no longer holds, and we find ourselves stumbling in the in-between. That's where we meet Saul today, not as the great apostle yet, not as Paul, but as a man on a mission, convinced he is right, certain in his cause, breathing threats, and sure of who the bad guys are. And isn't that how so many stories of transformation begin? With the illusion of clarity, with the kind of certainty that doesn't leave space for grace. But then a flash of light, a fall to the ground, a voice that cracks his world in two. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And just like that, the one who thought he saw so clearly is struck blind. You know, last week we spent some time reflecting together on the nature of seeing more clearly. But that is only half of the story, isn't it? Sometimes we have to deal with a lack of clarity or the inability to see. And so I wonder if you've ever had a moment like Saul. Not a beam of light from heaven per se, but a moment when your world shifted, when something you believed in broke apart and you couldn't see the road ahead anymore. A relationship ending, a certainty unraveling, a grief that disoriented you, a deep unlearning. Because that's what Saul is experiencing in this story. Not just a change of belief, but a dismantling, a darkness, a sacred pause. For 3 days he was without sight, and he neither ate nor drank, verse 9 says. 3 days, the space between the falling apart and the coming back together, the liminal zone, the hallway between who he was and who he was becoming. Notice with me that 3 days has quite a significance in the Judeo-Christian tradition, doesn't it? Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the whale for his transformation. Jesus was in the darkness of the tomb for 3 days before he was risen from the dead. This 3 days in the dark metaphor means something to these storytellers. It teaches each of us a posture that we too can enter into when we experience periods of darkness. Notice that Saul doesn't try to fix it, per se. He doesn't force a way forward. He just surrenders, and he waits, and he prays. This, too, is part of the spiritual journey. Sometimes the most faithful thing we can do is to stop striving and let ourselves be led by the hand through the dark to somewhere we don't yet understand. Are you with me? Do you know what I mean? Because transformation rarely begins with inspiration in the light. It usually begins with disorientation, and it takes time. But as we all know, the story doesn't end in the dark, does it? Somewhere across town, another man, Ananias, is having a moment. He doesn't want anything to do with this Saul guy. He's heard the stories. He knows the damage that he's done. He's wary, and rightly so. And yet, the voice comes to him too. Go, he is praying, he's been chosen. So Ananias goes, not with certainty, but certainly with courage, right? And he does something quietly miraculous. He places his hands on Saul and calls him what? Brother, right? What a word to use. Before there's repentance from Saul, before there's explanation as to what's going on with him, before there's been any public change in Saul, Ananias calls his wounded enemy brother. And in that moment, the scales fall from his eyes. And Saul sees, perhaps again for the first time, not just with his eyes, but with his whole being, like we talked about last week. So here's what I think this story teaches us if we're willing to let it speak to us. New beginnings don't start where everything just makes sense. They often start when it all falls apart. when the old ways no longer work, when we're led into a kind of darkness, not to punish us, but to prepare us for something new. The blindness isn't the end, it's actually the space where new vision can grow. And I want to suggest this morning that maybe this story isn't just about personal change and transformation, like Western Christianity would often lead us to believe. The blindness isn't the end, Maybe this story has something to say about where we are at right now as a nation and as a people and as a culture. There's so much uncertainty in the political future of America. Do you feel it? Anybody feel it a little bit? You know what I mean? So much fear, so much mistrust. People are feeling like things are falling apart, like the road ahead is obscured, and like no one can see clearly into our collective future. But what if this moment of not knowing isn't a failure, but an opportunity for a new beginning? What if, like Saul, we are in a collective in-between, a time when our old certainties no longer work, but the new world has not yet arrived? Now, I know that if we're being honest, many of us probably wish that some of those folks in charge of our country would have their own Damascus moment, right? Don't we wish that a little bit? Like, instead of defunding PBS, perhaps you could just actually invest in public education and the infrastructure we so desperately need right now. That would be one option, right? But, as Jesus taught us, we don't really control the soil of anyone else's heart, do we? And sometimes the seeds of truth and grace fall into the weeds, don't they? So while I'm sure many of us wish that America would wake up from its slumber, we also have to seriously consider for ourselves, what is mine to do in a time like this? What if this is a time to pray, to listen, and to pause before rushing to fix our problems? What if this is an invitation to see our neighbors not as enemies, but as fellow travelers in the dark? What if transformation, real sacred transformation, requires this moment of blindness? What if it requires humility? Requires that we stop trying to win and start learning how to see each other as siblings once again? That doesn't mean silence, in the face of injustice. It doesn't mean apathy. It means that perhaps our next collective awakening won't be found in louder arguments, but in a deeper willingness to be changed. And I want to also mention today that perhaps this story speaks to our church as well. Because many churches today find themselves not unlike us in a kind of Damascus moment, where old structures and assumptions and models are no longer serving the deeper work of spirit. We are living in a time where attendance is down, where questions are up, and certainties are dissolving. And it feels like blindness, can't it? Can it feel like that? But what if this isn't death? What if it's a sacred pause? What if this is not the end of faith communities altogether, but the beginning of some new form they can take? A form where being right matters less than being real, where hospitality matters more than hierarchy, where churches rediscover that they are not buildings or brands, but places of healing. What if our church can strive to be a place where someone like Ananias can place their hands on a wounded soul and call them brother, sister, or beloved? Maybe this season of uncertainty is preparing us for a more spacious faith, one not built on fear or performance, but on trust and listening and the willingness to be remade. So, if you feel overwhelmed, or perhaps uncertain right now about our country, about our community or our church, or even your own soul, you need to know that you are not alone and that perhaps you just might be in the 3 days in the dark. And the story tells us that we are not to fear the dark because it's where vision is born. But let's not stop there, because the story also tells us that when vision does come back, it rarely looks like a return to what was, right? It asks something new of us. It requires us to keep going forward. It asks us to walk a road we haven't walked before, to surrender our old maps, and especially to put on a new sacred imagination. Because when the scales fall, we don't just see differently, we're invited to live differently, to dream new dreams, to imagine new ways of being human together, to listen for a deeper call that might lead us down an unfamiliar road, like the one Ananias took to Saul, or the one Saul took into the unknown future of his own transformation. Darkness isn't just the womb of a new vision. It's also the threshold of a new path. So, I hope this story resonates a bit for us this morning in the season of our church, because perhaps we might need to see that we are also in this 3-day space. Maybe some of us feel like we've lost sight of what used to work. Anybody maybe feel that way a little bit? Maybe the structures feel tired, and the language doesn't quite fit anymore. And maybe the road ahead isn't yet clear, right? It isn't. But what if that's not a failure? Again, what if that's actually a sacred invitation? An invitation to stop clinging to what was and start imagining what could be. What if it's an invitation to seeing a new kind of spiritual community? One that is still rooted in ancient wisdom, but open to new forms. What if that's a place not defined by certainty, but by compassion? Not by size, but by soul. Not by only preserving the past, but also by hosting the future. And like Saul and like Ananias, perhaps our church will need a little bit of courage, to listen, to wait, to let go, and to say yes to a way that hasn't been walked yet, at least not here, So, if any of you feel like you're in a dark time of unknowing, I want to encourage us today, don't just wait for the light. Start listening for the dream that's daring to take shape inside you right now. The path that doesn't yet have a name, the whisper saying, go another way. Because this is how the sacred moves, not necessarily with perfect clarity all the time, but with a promise. You will be told what is yours to do, and you will not be alone when the time comes to see again.